Imagine you're at a birthday party. Difficult to imagine in quarantine, I know, but imagine you're at a birthday party. And at this birthday party, there is a birthday cake. In order to satiate all the guests at the party, the cake must be cut into equal slices. So what is the best way to cut the cake that ensures that all party guests get an equal slice of cake? Philosophers might say that the only way to ensure that each party guest gets an equal size slice of cake would be to make sure that the person who cuts the cake gets the last piece that is cut. In the interest of securing as much of the birthday cake for themselves as possible, the individual charged with cutting the cake should cut each piece into equal size slices, as this is the only way to guarantee they will get the biggest slice of the cake possible. As surface level as this thought experiment might be, it gives us valuable insight into how we think about the motivations of individuals and the equality of resources. First, this specific answer of how to best divide the birthday cake reveals that we believe that any and all humans will act selfishly when given the opportunity to secure more resources for themselves if possible. It doesn't matter which one of the party guests is tasked with dividing up the birthday cake. The only way to curb their insatiable desire for cake is to limit them to the last possible piece that exists. This thought experiment also presumes that cake slices that are cut into the exact same size is the only way to ensure equality of cake consumption. But what about the person whose birthday it is? Surely they deserve more cake than the rest of their guests. Or what if someone is on a diet and they can't consume as much cake as everyone else? Even more so, what if someone got drastically lost on their way to the party and hadn't eaten all day? Surely they deserve a larger slice of cake to ameliorate a larger need for food. In these instances, equality does not look like an even distribution of resources. It looks like an uneven distribution of resources in favor of those who need the most amount of cake. If the starving person gets the same amount of cake as the person on a diet, and by the end of eating their cake, the starving person is still hungry, and the person on the diet hasn't even finished their slice of cake, is that really the most efficient way to utilize the cake? John Rawls, a famous political philosopher buried here at Mount Auburn, would argue no. Exactly the same size slice of cake is not a fair distribution of resources. Okay, let's stop talking about cake and start talking about what we really mean. Cake in this instance symbolizes resources, and the person cutting the cake symbolizes our government deciding through policy who gets access to what resources, such as money, shelter, land, food, water, education, healthcare, jobs, etc. Rawls poses that the path to creating a truly fair distribution of resources lies in another thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. Suppose you are sitting unborn inside your mother's womb. There are very few things that you know about the world that you are about to enter into, but you do know a handful of things. First, you know that resources are moderately scarce. There is enough food, shelter, education, healthcare, jobs, etc., for everyone who is born into this world. However, you know that these resources are sometimes distributed in ways that makes them accessible to some and inaccessible to others. Secondly, you know that people have religious or moral beliefs that sometimes impact how resources are distributed. And lastly, you know that things like racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, ageism, etc. exist in this world. But you specifically know nothing about yourself. You know nothing of your race, your gender, your physical ability, your sexual identity. You know nothing of your parents' class or their religion. You know nothing. Then you are asked the same question again. What is the best way to distribute resources in this world? What systems and assurances would have to be in place to make it feel safe for you to enter this world, regardless of what circumstances? According to Rawls, the answer of a reasonable citizen could only logically conclude that the poorest and the most disadvantaged groups need the most help from the government in securing resources, because they are the ones that suffer the consequences of inequality the most. The beauty of John Rawls's veil of ignorance thought experiment is that it forces us into imaginative thinking that is so often dismissed as unrealistic in our political discourse. We realize inequality exists, but we often dismiss it as a function of our society, something as scientifically unchangeable as natural selection. In the core of the veil of ignorance experiment is Rawls's universal point that we can all agree we are living in a society of inequity. But often in our political debates, we get bogged down with questions of whether or not these problems are structural, or whether or not these problems serve as motivation to move up the social ladder. His veil of ignorance experiment forces the privileged to confront the humanitarian consequences of inaction. John Rawls was a statistician, and he recognized that the rags to riches story in the United States was more useful for political rhetoric than it was for demonstrating actionable pathways out of poverty and discrimination. These anecdotes provide evidence that hard work and determination can end cycles of inequality through meritocracy. See, our system is working just fine. But John Rawls would pose that these individual stories do not encompass the entirety of the American experience, and furthermore serve as distractions from the wider conversations we are having about societal and structural change to tip the scales in the favor of the more disadvantaged groups. In his book, A Theory of Justice, John Rawls poses a definition for reasonable citizens.
Reasonable citizens want to live in a society in which they can cooperate with their fellow citizens on terms that are acceptable to all. They are willing to propose and abide by mutually acceptable rules, given the assurance that others will also do so. They will also honor these rules, even when that means sacrificing their own particular interests. Reasonable citizens want, in short, to belong to a society where political power is legitimately used.
Reasonable citizens have their own frame of viewing the world. They have their own religious beliefs, or lack thereof, and their own moral philosophical values. But because they are reasonable citizens, they will not force their worldview on other people. But how is it possible that people with deep-seated moral beliefs that some things are good and some things are bad would want the government to protect the things they believe to be bad? Wouldn't that make themselves immoral? Rawls explains that reasonable citizens are tolerant because in a free-thinking society, they understand that people will answer the difficult questions about life, existence, reason, good and bad in different ways. But this does not change their overall desire to live in a more equal society where the circumstances of one's birth have no bearing on standard of living. John Rawls, buried here on Harvard Hill in Mount Auburn Cemetery, believes that there is a difference between political virtue and moral virtue. Moral virtue can come in the forms of religious beliefs or philosophical convictions. In other words, moral virtue gives an individual a blueprint for how to lead a good life. On the other hand, political virtue need not be interpreted through the lens of an ethical lifestyle, but rather what makes someone a good citizen of a liberal state. The danger of conflating these two virtues lies in the inherent inequity present between people who lead what are considered to be good, moral, virtuous lifestyles and those who do not. In a multicultural society, who gets to decide what is morally virtuous? And furthermore, is it fair that those who do get to decide what is morally virtuous also get to decide what is politically virtuous? Author Tim Soutphommasane calls this conflation ethical ventriloquism.
The state substituting its view of a good life for those conceptions held by autonomous individuals. There can be no liberal citizenship, not least in a society containing a pluralism of moral beliefs and practices, where there is an authoritarian coercion or perfectionist paternalism.
At the time that John Rawls released his book A Theory of Justice in 1971, and still to this day, the United States was grappling with a narrative being questioned. Rawls clearly believes that there are certain personal things that should not be political. Religious affiliation should have no bearing on what the government considers virtuous. Personal beliefs about the inferiority of others is not reasonable, and therefore should have no place in a justice system that is dedicated to fairness.